"You're going to bathe me now," the millionaire said. She obeyed him, but she didn't know she would dive into the dirtiest past of her own lineage. An intimate gesture became a pact, and their love a curse inherited. If you like love and romance stories, watch until the end. Subscribe to this channel and leave your comments saying where you're listening. There was an ancient silence in that dark stone mansion built upon the cliffs of Ravenshollow, as if time itself had surrendered to the memory of the dead. Eloise climbed the winding path with uncertain steps, the sky pouring a fine rain that clung to her hair, like fingers from the past trying to hold her back. She was only 19, but her eyes held the weight of someone who had learned early to hide questions. In her hands she carried a simple suitcase, and in her chest an inherited mission, to find Raphael Montenegro, the man who had once destroyed her family, or so her grandmother had said in a letter sealed with tears and warnings. Raphael, the legendary magnate of the shipping industry, had vanished from society after a scandal wrapped in tragedies and rumors. Accused of bankrupting his own company, ostracized after a mysterious accident at sea that left him partially paralyzed, he had taken refuge in the mansion where he was born. There, removed from the world, he cultivated not only his own pain but secrets that breathed through the walls. They said he had gone mad, that he spoke to ghosts, that he was cruel to the few employees, and that no one could bear to remain in that house for more than a week. Eloise, however, had not come there to care for an invalid. She had come to seek truths, even if she didn't know exactly which ones. The rain had grown heavier by the time she reached the imposing iron gates that guarded the Montenegro estate. Through the bars, she could see the mansion looming against the grey Yorkshire sky like a wounded beast, its Gothic towers and gargoyles seeming to watch her approach with stone eyes. The groundskeeper who let her in was a bent old man who spoke not a word, merely gestured for her to follow him up the gravel drive that crunched beneath their feet like broken bones. Ravenshollow Manor rose before her in all its dark majesty, built from local limestone that had weathered to the colour of old bones. Ivy crept up its walls like desperate fingers, and the windows, those that weren't boarded up, reflected nothing but emptiness. The house had been in the Montenegro family for 3 centuries, built by a shipping baron who had made his fortune in the darkest days of England's maritime empire. Now it stood as a monument to faded glory and buried secrets. The inside of the house was even more oppressive than its exterior. Heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light, and the air smelled of dust, old wood, and something else, something that reminded Eloise of grief made tangible. The walls were lined with portraits of Montenegro ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her movements as the silent groundskeeper led her through corridors that stretched into shadow. "He's expecting you," were the first and only words the old man spoke, his voice rough as sandpaper. He gestured towards a heavy oak door at the end of a particularly dark hallway, then disappeared as quietly as he had appeared, leaving Eloise alone with her racing heart and the weight of generations watching from their gilded frames. She knocked, and a voice from within called for her to enter. The voice was deep, cultured, with the precise diction of the upper classes, but there was something else beneath it, a roughness that spoke of pain and isolation. The study she entered was vast, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes and maritime charts. A fire crackled in an enormous stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the room. But it was the man seated behind the massive mahogany desk who commanded her attention completely. Raphael Montenegro was not what she had expected. Even seated in his wheelchair, he possessed a presence that filled the room like smoke, dense, cutting, disturbing. He appeared to be in his early 40s, with dark hair shot through with premature silver, and sharp features that might have been carved from the same stone as his ancestral home. His eyes, when they met hers, were the colour of storm clouds over the North Sea, and they held a depth of pain and intelligence that made her breath catch. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving over her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she forced herself to meet his stare, remembering her grandmother's words about strength being the only currency that mattered in a world ruled by powerful men. "So," he said finally, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "you're the granddaughter of Margaret Hartwell." The use of her grandmother's maiden name sent a chill through Eloise. How did he know? Her grandmother had been Margaret Clayton for as long as Eloise could remember, had taken her husband's name when she married at 17. But before that, "You know who I am," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I know many things," Raphael replied, wheeling his chair around the desk to face her more directly. "I know that you've come here believing I destroyed your family. I know that you carry your grandmother's eyes and her stubborn chin. And I know that you have no idea what you've walked into." There was no warmth in his voice, no welcome. But there was something else, a recognition that made her skin prickle with unease. He looked at her as if he were seeing a ghost, a reflection of something long buried. "I've come for the truth," Eloise said, lifting her chin in the defiant gesture he had already noted. "About what you did to my grandmother. About why she spent her whole life afraid to speak your name." Raphael's laugh was sharp and bitter. "The truth? The truth is a luxury people like you can't afford, Miss Clayton. The truth is that your grandmother was a fool who fell in love with the wrong man. The truth is that I was young and arrogant and believed that money and power could buy absolution for any sin. The truth is that we both paid prices that are still being collected decades later." He moved his wheelchair closer to her, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver stubble on his jaw, the way his hands gripped the arms of his chair with white-knuckled intensity. "But none of that matters now," he continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "What matters is that you're here, and you're going to stay until I decide you can leave." "I'm not a prisoner," Eloise protested. But even as she said it, she was aware of how isolated this place was, how far from the nearest village, how completely she was at his mercy. "Aren't you?" Raphael's smile was sharp as a knife's edge. "Look around you, Miss Clayton. This house has been keeping secrets for centuries. What's one more?" Before she could respond, he was moving again, wheeling himself towards the door. "Mrs. Pemberton will show you to your room," he said without looking back. "Dinner is at 8. Don't be late." Mrs. Pemberton turned out to be the housekeeper, a thin woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to see everything and judge it all wanting. She led Eloise through more dark corridors to a room on the second floor that was larger than her entire flat in London. "This was Miss Montenegro's room," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice carefully neutral. "Mr. Raphael's sister. She died young." The room was decorated in shades of deep blue and silver, with heavy Victorian furniture that seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the tall windows. The bed was a massive four-poster affair with curtains that could be drawn for complete privacy, and there was a writing desk positioned beneath one of the windows that looked out over the wild Yorkshire moors. "What happened to her?" Eloise asked, running her fingers along the smooth surface of the desk. Mrs. Pemberton's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "She fell," she said simply, "from the cliffs. It was a long time ago." After the housekeeper left, Eloise sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened since her arrival. The house felt alive around her, creaking and settling with sounds that might have been the wind or might have been something else entirely. She could hear the distant crash of waves against the cliffs below, a constant reminder of the dangerous beauty that surrounded this place. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her clothes in the massive wardrobe that smelled of lavender and old wood. In the bottom of her suitcase, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was her grandmother's letter, the letter that had brought her here. She had read it so many times that she knew every word by heart, but she unfolded it again, needing the familiar comfort of her grandmother's handwriting. "My dearest Eloise," it began, "there are things about our family that I have never told you, secrets that I hoped would die with me. But I find that I cannot leave this world without giving you the choice that I never had, the choice to know the truth about where you come from and what was taken from us. The name Raphael Montenegro should mean nothing to you, but he is the reason we lived so quietly, so carefully, always looking over our shoulders." The letter went on to tell a story of forbidden love and crushing betrayal, of a young woman from a humble background who had caught the eye of a powerful man's son, of a pregnancy that was covered up, and a child who had died in infancy. It painted Raphael as a villain who had used and discarded her grandmother like a plaything, leaving her broken and afraid. But the man she had met downstairs didn't match the monster from her grandmother's story. Dangerous, yes. Intimidating, certainly. But there was something in his eyes that spoke of suffering rather than malice, of wounds that ran as deep as her own family's scars. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Clayton?" Mrs. Pemberton's voice called through the heavy wood. Mr. Raphael asks that you join him in the blue drawing room. He says there are things you need to know before dinner. Eloise found Raphael waiting for her in a room that must once have been magnificent, but now felt like a mausoleum. The furniture was covered in dust sheets, and more portraits lined the walls, generations of Montenegro men and women staring down with expressions ranging from pride to madness. "Tell me about the night your grandmother died," Raphael said without preamble. He had positioned himself near the fireplace, the flames casting shadows across his face that made him look older, more careworn. "How did you know she was dead?" Eloise asked, her heart racing. The funeral had been small, private. She had told no one about her plans to come here. "I make it my business to know about the people who matter," he replied. Margaret Hartwell mattered. She mattered more than she ever knew. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. This came for her 30 years too late. The Postal Service found it in a batch of undelivered mail from the 1980s. By the time it reached her old address, she was already gone. With trembling fingers, Eloise took the letter. The handwriting was Raphael's, younger and more hopeful than the man who sat before her now. "My darling Margaret," it read, "I know you must hate me for what happened, for how my father treated you, for my own cowardice in not standing up to him sooner. But I want you to know that I tried to find you after you left. I've been trying ever since. The child you carried was mine, and I would have claimed him, would have married you despite everything if you had given me the chance. I know now that my father threatened you, paid you to disappear, told you lies about what I wanted. Please, if you're reading this, please write back. I've been living half a life without you, and I don't know how much longer I can bear it. All my love always, Raphael." The letter blurred as tears filled Eloise's eyes. This wasn't the story her grandmother had told, wasn't the truth she had carried to her grave. But which version was real? Which version could she believe? "She never received it," Raphael said quietly. "She died thinking I'd abandoned her, that I had used her and thrown her away like rubbish. And I lived for 30 years thinking she had chosen to disappear rather than be with me." "But the baby," Eloise whispered, "died. I know that much. My father saw to it that I learned every cruel detail, how she lost the child in the 6th month, how she nearly died herself, how she was turned away from every doctor in London because someone had spread word that she was a fortune hunter, a woman of loose morals. He wanted me to know the consequences of defying him." The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind against the windows. Eloise stared at the letter in her hands, trying to reconcile this version of events with everything she had believed. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked finally. "Because you deserve to know the truth about your grandmother," Raphael said, "and because," and he paused, seeming to struggle with the words, "because when I look at you, I see her as she was when we first met. Young and fierce and beautiful, with eyes that could see right through all the lies people tell themselves to feel better about their choices." The intensity in his voice made something flutter in her chest, a warmth that she immediately tried to suppress. This was the man who might have, she didn't know what to think anymore. "There's something else," Raphael continued. He wheeled himself to an antique writing desk and removed a key from his waistcoat. "Something I've never shown anyone." The key opened a locked drawer, from which he withdrew a small portrait in an ornate silver frame. The painting showed a young woman with dark hair and striking eyes, her expression caught somewhere between joy and sorrow. "My father commissioned this portrait of Margaret when she was carrying my child," Raphael said, his voice barely audible. "He kept it, I think, to remind himself of his own cruelty. I found it after he died, hidden away with documents about the payments he made to ensure she stayed away from London." Eloise gasped. The woman in the portrait was unmistakably her grandmother, but younger than she had ever seen her in photographs. And there, in the careful brushstrokes, was the gentle curve of early pregnancy. "She was beautiful," Eloise whispered. "She was everything," Raphael replied. "And I was too young and too proud to fight for her the way I should have. I let my father dictate the terms of my life, and by the time I found the courage to rebel, it was too late." They stood in silence, looking at the portrait that connected past and present, love and loss. Finally, Eloise looked up at him, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since her arrival. "What happened to you?" she asked. "The accident, the wheelchair." His expression hardened. "That's a story for another day," he said, taking the portrait back and locking it away. "Right now you need to decide what you're going to do with what I've told you." "I don't understand." "You came here for revenge," Raphael said bluntly. "You came here believing I was the villain in your family's story. Now you know the truth, or at least part of it. So what happens next? Do you leave? Do you stay and try to understand the rest? Or do you decide that it doesn't matter, that the sins of the previous generation aren't worth reliving?" Before Eloise could answer, a bell chimed somewhere in the depths of the house. Raphael smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Dinner," he said. "Mrs. Pemberton will be furious if we're late. The dead may have all the time in the world, but the living still have schedules to keep." As they made their way to the dining room, Eloise found herself studying Raphael's profile, trying to reconcile the bitter, isolated man he had become with the young lover who had written such desperate letters. What had happened in the intervening years to change him so completely? And why did she find herself wanting to know, despite everything she had believed about him? The dining room was another exercise in faded grandeur, with a table that could have seated 20, but was set for only 2. Candles flickered in silver candelabras, casting dancing shadows on the dark wood paneling. Mrs. Pemberton served a meal of roasted beef and vegetables in complete silence, her movements efficient, but somehow disapproving. "Tell me about your life," Raphael said as they ate. "Your grandmother raised you?" "After my parents died, yes," Eloise replied. "I was 8. She never talked much about her past. I always thought it was because she was ashamed of being poor, of having to work as a seamstress to survive." "Ashamed," Raphael repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. She should have been proud. She built a life from nothing, raised a granddaughter who has the courage to walk into a stranger's house and demand answers. That takes more strength than most people possess. She was strong, Eloise agreed, but she was also afraid. She never trusted easily, never let anyone get too close. I used to think it was just her personality. But now you know she had reasons. They finished the meal in relative silence, but Eloise was acutely aware of Raphael's presence across from her, the way he moved his hands when he spoke, the intensity of his gaze when he thought she wasn't looking, the barely controlled energy that seemed to radiate from him despite his physical limitations. After dinner, he led her back to the study, where the fire had been built up again and brandy waited in crystal decanters. "I should warn you," he said as he poured himself a drink, "that living in this house isn't easy. The walls hold too many memories, and the memories aren't all pleasant. If you're going to stay, and I hope you will, you need to understand that there are rooms you shouldn't enter, questions you shouldn't ask. At least not yet. Are you threatening me?" Eloise asked. "I'm trying to protect you," Raphael replied. "This family has a talent for destroying the people it claims to love. I won't let that happen to you." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She had expected more manipulation, more of the cold control he had displayed earlier. Instead, he seemed almost vulnerable, as if admitting his concern for her safety had cost him something. "I can take care of myself," she said. "Can you?" He wheeled closer to her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that made her think of winter nights and forbidden pleasures. "This house has been the death of stronger people than you, Eloise. Beautiful, curious women who ask too many questions and learn too much for their own good. Like your sister." His face went completely still. "What do you know about Isabel?" "Nothing. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned that she died young, that she fell from the cliffs." "Isabel didn't fall," Raphael said quietly. "She jumped. The question that's haunted this family for 20 years is why." The admission hung in the air between them, like a challenge. Eloise felt as if she were standing on the edge of an abyss, with Raphael offering her his hand, but she couldn't tell if he meant to pull her back to safety or push her over the edge. "I should go to bed," she said, setting down her untouched brandy. "Yes," he agreed. "Tomorrow, if you're still here, we'll talk about what comes next." As she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Eloise." She turned back to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "Your room locks from the inside," he said. "I'd advise you to use it." The words followed her up the dark staircase like whispered warnings. In her room, Eloise did indeed turn the heavy key in the lock, though she couldn't say whether she was keeping danger out or herself in. The sound of the mechanism engaging seemed unnaturally loud in the silence of the old house. She prepared for bed mechanically, her mind still reeling from everything Raphael had revealed. The letter, the portrait, the suggestion that her grandmother's version of events had been incomplete at best, deliberately distorted at worst. How many other lies had shaped her understanding of her family's history? How many truths remained buried in this house of shadows? Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with dreams. She found herself walking through endless corridors, lined with portraits that watched her with living eyes. Sometimes the faces were strangers, Montenegro ancestors she had never seen, but sometimes they were familiar. Her grandmother, young and radiant as she had appeared in Raphael's hidden portrait. Her parents, who had died when she was too young to really remember them. And always, at the end of the corridor, a door that remained just out of reach no matter how far she walked. She woke before dawn to the sound of voices in the corridor outside her room. Low, urgent whispers that seemed to fade whenever she tried to focus on the words. When she finally worked up the courage to unlock her door and peer out, the hallway was empty, lit only by the grey light filtering through a window at the far end. But someone had been there. She could smell the faint trace of cigarette smoke, and on the floor just outside her door, barely visible in the dim light, were muddy footprints that hadn't been there the night before. The discovery sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the morning cold. Who had been standing outside her room and why? She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and bacon to what must be the breakfast room. It was smaller than the dining room, but no less elegant, with windows that looked out over the moors toward the village she had passed through the day before. The distance looked impossibly vast in the morning light, too far to walk if she needed to leave quickly. Mrs. Pemberton was setting the table with efficient, silent movements. She barely acknowledged Eloise's arrival with a nod, but poured coffee without being asked and set out a plate of eggs and toast. "Where is Mr. Montenegro?" Eloise asked. "Gone riding," Mrs. Pemberton replied curtly. "He rises early and takes his horse out along the cliff tops. Has done every morning for 20 years, rain or shine. Riding?" Eloise couldn't hide her surprise. "But his wheelchair." "The wheelchair is for inside the house," the housekeeper said, her voice carefully neutral. "His legs were damaged in the accident, but they still work well enough for some things. The horse doesn't mind carrying a man who can't feel everything he should." The implication hung in the air. Raphael's disability was more complex than he had let on, neither as complete nor as simple as it appeared. Eloise filed this information away with all the other mysteries that seemed to multiply every time she learned something new about this place. She ate breakfast alone, listening to the wind outside and the subtle sounds of the house settling around her. When she was finished, Mrs. Pemberton appeared as if summoned and began clearing the dishes with the same silent efficiency. "Mrs. Pemberton," Eloise said, "how long have you worked here?" The older woman paused, a plate halfway to the sideboard. 23 years this autumn. "So you knew his sister Isabel." The plate resumed its journey, but Eloise noticed the slight tremor in the housekeeper's hands. "I knew her." "What was she like?" "Miss Isabel was—" Mrs. Pemberton set the plate down carefully and turned to face Eloise fully. "Miss Isabel was troubled. Beautiful and brilliant and troubled. She saw things that weren't there. Heard voices in empty rooms. Toward the end she barely slept, barely ate. We all tried to help her, but some people are too damaged to be saved, Miss Clayton. Some wounds go too deep to heal." The housekeeper's words stayed with Eloise as she explored the house that morning. With Raphael gone, she felt freer to investigate, to try to understand the place that had shaped him and destroyed his sister. The ground floor was all formal rooms, drawing rooms and dining rooms and libraries that felt frozen in time. The walls were lined with paintings and photographs that told the story of the Montenegro family's rise to prominence in the shipping industry. She found Raphael's father's portrait in the main hall, a stern man with cold eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently set in disapproval. According to the small brass plaque beneath it, Don Montenegro had built the family fortune from a single cargo ship into one of England's largest shipping conglomerates. He had also apparently been the kind of man who would pay to destroy a young woman's life, rather than allow his son to marry beneath his station. The second floor held the bedrooms, including her own, and what she assumed was Raphael's suite at the far end of the corridor. But it was the third floor that drew her attention, a level she hadn't yet explored, with narrower corridors and smaller rooms that must once have housed servants or children. One door stood slightly ajar, revealing a room that was clearly different from the others. While the rest of the house was kept in perfect museum-like condition, this room showed signs of recent use. There were fresh flowers in a vase by the window, and the furniture had been arranged not for display but for comfort. Eloise pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was decorated in soft yellows and greens, with watercolor paintings of wildflowers on the walls. An easel stood in the corner, and beside it a table covered with paints and brushes. The painting on the easel was unfinished, a seascape showing the view from the house toward the horizon, but with storm clouds gathering in the distance that weren't visible in the actual sky outside. "You shouldn't be in here." The voice from the doorway made her jump. She turned to find an old man watching her with pale, intelligent eyes. He was clearly a servant. His clothes were simple and worn, and his hands were stained with what looked like soil and paint. But there was something in his bearing, in the way he held himself, that suggested he was more than just a groundskeeper. "I'm sorry," Eloise said. "The door was open and I—" "Curious," he said, not unkindly. "Like she was. Always poking about where she shouldn't, asking questions that had no good answers." "Isabel?" The old man nodded. "Miss Isabel painted in here toward the end. Said the light was better up here, that she could see things more clearly from this height." He moved into the room with surprising grace for his age, approaching the easel with the familiarity of long practice. "This was her last painting," he said, gesturing toward the unfinished seascape. "Started it the day before she died. Never got to finish it." "You're the one who takes care of her things," Eloise realized. "You keep the room exactly as she left it." "Someone should remember," he said simply. "Someone should know that she tried to paint her way out of the darkness." "What's your name?" Eloise asked. The old man studied her for a long moment, as if deciding whether she could be trusted with the truth. "Thomas," he said finally, "I've been the groundskeeper here since before you were born." There was something about the way he said it, something about the careful distance he maintained, even as he spoke. That made Eloise wonder if Thomas was telling her everything. But before she could ask more questions, the sound of hoofbeats on gravel announced Raphael's return. "You'd better go," Thomas said, already moving toward the door. "He doesn't like people in Miss Isabel's room." Eloise made her way back to the main floor, her mind churning with new questions. Who exactly was Thomas? And what was his connection to the family beyond his role as groundskeeper? Why did he care so much about preserving Isabel's memory? And what had Isabel seen in this house that had driven her to such despair? She found Raphael in the study, still in his riding clothes. The physical activity had brought color to his face and seemed to have loosened some of the rigid control he usually maintained. His dark hair was tousled by the wind, and there was mud on his boots that spoke of hard riding across rough terrain. "Good morning," he said, looking up from a pile of correspondence on his desk. "I trust you slept well?" "Someone was outside my door last night," Eloise said without preamble. "I heard voices and there were muddy footprints in the corridor this morning." Raphael's expression sharpened. "What kind of voices?" "Whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like two people having an urgent conversation." He was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming against the arm of his wheelchair. "This house has many servants," he said finally. "And they have their own concerns, their own conversations. Old houses carry sound in unexpected ways. Voices from the kitchen can seem to come from upstairs. Conversations in the garden can echo in the corridors." It was a reasonable explanation, but something in his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe it himself. Eloise filed this away with all the other mysteries that seemed to multiply hourly in this place. "I met Thomas this morning," she said, changing the subject. "He was in Isabel's room." This time, Raphael's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His face went white, and his hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair with enough force to whiten his knuckles. "You were in Isabel's room?" "The door was open. Thomas said he maintains it, keeps it exactly as she left it." "Thomas had no business letting you." "In there," Raphael said, his voice tight with anger. That room is private, off limits. Why? What are you hiding? For a moment she thought he might answer. His face cycled through several emotions, anger, pain, something that might have been fear. But then the familiar mask slipped back into place, and when he spoke his voice was coldly controlled. There are things in this house that are dangerous to disturb, he said. Isabel's death was complicated. The room holds memories that are better left undisturbed. Complicated how? That's not your concern. His dismissive tone sparked a flare of anger in her chest. Everything about this house is my concern, she said, standing up and moving to face him directly. You brought me here, Raphael. You told me I needed to know the truth about my grandmother, about what happened between you. Well, Isabel is part of that truth, isn't she? Her death, whatever drove her to it, it's all connected. Raphael stared up at her, and for a moment the air between them crackled with tension that had nothing to do with anger. She was close enough to see the flecks of gold in his grey eyes, close enough to catch the scent of leather and horses that clung to his clothes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, despite the coolness of the room. You don't know what you're asking, he said quietly. Then tell me. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Raphael looked away, breaking the spell. Isabel killed herself because she discovered something about our family that she couldn't live with, he said. She found letters, documents, evidence of things our father did that went far beyond paying off one young woman to disappear. She learned about other women, other children, other lives destroyed for the sake of the Montenegro reputation. And she learned about Thomas. What about Thomas? Thomas is my brother. The words hit Eloise like a physical blow. Your brother? Half-brother, to be precise, the product of one of our father's many indiscretions. A stable girl who caught his eye when he was already married to my mother. When Thomas was born, my father couldn't acknowledge him publicly, so he kept him here on the estate as a servant. Thomas has lived his entire life knowing exactly who he is, and knowing that he can never claim his birthright. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together in Eloise's mind, forming a picture that was far darker than she had imagined. And Isabel couldn't live with knowing this? Isabel couldn't live with knowing that our father had done to dozens of other families what he did to your grandmother. She found evidence that he had been systematically destroying the lives of women and children for decades, all to protect the family name. And she found out that I knew. You knew? Raphael's face was a mask of pain. I've known about Thomas since I was 12 years old. I've known about the others since I was 18. And I did nothing. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment to act, waiting until I had enough power to challenge him. But the truth is I was a coward. I was comfortable being the heir, being the legitimate son, so it was easier to ignore what was right in front of me. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest and devastating. Eloise felt her understanding of Raphael shift again, the pieces of his character rearranging themselves into a new pattern. He wasn't the monster from her grandmother's story, but he wasn't entirely innocent either. He was something more complex, a man who had been shaped by forces beyond his control, but who had also made choices, some of them terrible ones. What happened to change things? She asked. The accident, Raphael said simply. 20 years ago I was on a ship, one of our cargo vessels, making a routine run to Hamburg. There was a storm and something went wrong with the engine. The ship went down and I barely survived. My legs were crushed, and for a while the doctors thought I might die. He paused, lost in the memory. Lying in that hospital bed, thinking I might never walk again, never have children, never have the chance to make amends for all the things I hadn't done. It changes you. I realized that I had wasted my life being afraid of my father, being afraid of scandal, being afraid of doing what was right. So you came back here and tried to make amends? I tried. I brought Thomas into the house, gave him a position that was more than just a servant. I started quietly investigating the other families my father had destroyed, trying to find ways to help them. I set up trust funds, anonymous donations, scholarship programs, anything I could do to try to balance the scales. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough, Raphael agreed. And Isabel knew it. She wanted me to go public, to expose everything our father had done, to drag the Montenegro name through the mud until there was nothing left of our reputation. She said it was the only way to truly honor the people he had hurt. But you refused. I tried to find a middle ground. I thought we could do more good working quietly, using our resources to help people without destroying everything in the process. Isabel saw it as another form of cowardice, another way of protecting the family name at the expense of justice. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling around the house's ancient stones with a sound like distant voices. The night she died, Raphael continued, his voice barely above a whisper, we had a terrible argument. She accused me of being just like our father, of caring more about my comfort than about the people we had hurt. She said she would expose everything herself if I wouldn't do it. And what? I told her I would have her declared mentally unstable if she tried. I told her no one would believe a woman who saw visions and heard voices. I used her illness against her, weaponized her pain to protect my own interests. The confession hit Eloise like a physical blow. Raphael. She walked out of this room and went straight to the cliffs. Thomas found her body the next morning. His voice broke on the last words, and for a moment, the carefully controlled mask slipped completely, revealing the depth of his guilt and grief. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the revelation settling between them like a physical presence. Finally, Eloise spoke. Is that why you've isolated yourself here? Penance for what you said to her? Partly. But also because I realized she was right. I am a coward. And cowards don't deserve to be part of the world. The bitter self-hatred in his voice sparked something protective in Eloise's chest. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his hand, covering his fingers with hers. That's not true, she said. You're not your father, Raphael. You're not the same man who destroyed my grandmother's life. He looked down at their joined hands with an expression of wonder, as if he had forgotten what human touch could feel like. Aren't I? He asked. I've brought you here under false pretenses, Eloise. I've manipulated you into staying, used your desire for truth as a way to keep you in this house. How is that different from what my father did to Margaret? The question hung in the air between them, dangerous and loaded with implications. Eloise felt the weight of it settling over her like a blanket, warm and suffocating at the same time, because the truth was, she no longer wanted to leave. The truth was a dangerous thing to acknowledge, even to herself. As the days blended into each other at Ravenshollow Manor, Eloise found herself falling into a rhythm that felt both natural and terrifying. She woke each morning to the sound of hoofbeats on gravel as Raphael took his solitary ride along the cliffs. She breakfasted alone while Mrs. Pemberton moved through the house like a ghost, efficient and silent. And she spent her afternoons in the study with Raphael, ostensibly learning more about her grandmother's story, but increasingly drawn into conversations that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the dangerous present they were creating together. He was nothing like the men she had known in London, the university boys who had pursued her with clumsy enthusiasm, the colleagues at the small accounting firm where she had worked, who treated her like a pretty ornament to be admired, but not taken seriously. Raphael possessed a gravity that drew her in like a tide, pulling her deeper into waters where she could no longer touch the bottom. It had been a week since his confession about Isabel, and the knowledge sat between them like a sleeping beast that neither dared to wake. He had shown her vulnerability, admitted to cowardice and cruelty, and somehow that honesty had made him more compelling rather than less. She found herself studying the lines around his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, noting the way his hands moved when he spoke about things that mattered to him, memorizing the rare moments when his careful control slipped, and she caught glimpses of the man he might have been in a different life. This particular morning found her in the library, a vast room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that smelled of age and secrets. Many of the books were in languages she couldn't read, Latin, Greek, what looked like Portuguese or Spanish, but others were in English, and she had found herself drawn to the section devoted to maritime history. The Montenegro shipping empire had left its mark here too, in first edition accounts of voyages and trade routes, in technical manuals for ship construction, in legal documents that traced the family's rise to prominence through the 18th and 19th centuries. She was absorbed in a particularly detailed account of a Montenegro vessel that had disappeared off the coast of Spain in 1847, when she became aware that she was no longer alone. The awareness came gradually, a sense of being watched that raised the fine hairs on her arms, a shift in the quality of silence that suggested another presence. She looked up to find Thomas standing in the doorway, his pale eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her suddenly conscious of how isolated this part of the house was from the main living areas. "You're reading about the Santa Isabella," he said, moving into the room with that surprisingly graceful step she had noticed before. "She went down in a storm," they said. "All hands lost. You know about it?" Eloise asked, closing the book but keeping her finger in the page. "I know about all of them," Thomas replied. "Every ship the Montenegros ever lost, every man who died in their service, every family left behind to grieve. It's amazing what you learn when you spend your whole life invisible." There was something in his tone that made her look at him more carefully. In the week since Raphael had revealed their relationship, she had observed Thomas from a distance, trying to understand how it felt to live as a servant in the house where you should have been an heir. But up close she could see things she had missed before, the way he held himself, the intelligence in his eyes, the carefully modulated voice that spoke of education, far beyond what most groundskeepers possessed. "Raphael told me about your father," she said carefully. "About what he did to your mother." Thomas's smile was sharp as a blade. "Did he tell you what he did to me?" "He said your father kept you here as a servant, that he couldn't acknowledge you publicly. Kept me here, yes, but not just as a servant." Thomas moved closer, and she caught the scent of earth and something else, something chemical that made her think of laboratories or workshops. "He had me educated by private tutors, the same ones who taught Raphael and Isabel. He made sure I learned everything a Montenegro heir should know: languages, mathematics, history, navigation, business. Everything except how to claim what should have been mine." The bitterness in his voice was like acid, eating through the careful politeness of his words. Eloise found herself shifting in her chair, suddenly aware of how alone they were. "Why would he do that?" she asked. "Why educate you if he never intended to acknowledge you?" "Because Don Montenegro was a man who believed in having all possible advantages," Thomas said. "I wasn't just his illegitimate son. I was his insurance policy. If something happened to Raphael, if the legitimate heir proved inadequate, he wanted to have a backup who could step in and protect the family interests. Of course, I would have done it from the shadows, as an advisor or manager, never with the Montenegro name. But the knowledge would be there when it was needed, and you accepted that. I was a child. What choice did I have?" Thomas had reached the shelf where she was sitting now, close enough that she could see the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "But children grow up, Miss Clayton. They learn to see the world clearly, and sometimes they learn that justice requires taking matters into your own hands." Something cold crawled up Eloise's spine. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering directly, Thomas reached past her to pull a slim volume from the shelf. His arm brushed against her shoulder as he did, and she was startled by the warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of his shirt. "This is what you should be reading," he said, opening the book to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "The manifest from the cargo ship that went down 20 years ago. The ship Raphael was on when he had his accident." Eloise took the book with hands that trembled slightly. The page showed a detailed listing of cargo: grain, textiles, manufactured goods, all routine shipments for a commercial vessel. But there, near the bottom of the list, was an entry that made her blood run cold. "Personal effects and private correspondence. R. Montenegro. Destination: private storage. Hamburg." "He was taking documents to Germany," she said, looking up at Thomas. "What kind of documents?" "The kind that could have destroyed the Montenegro reputation forever," Thomas replied. "Evidence of everything his father had done, every family that had been destroyed, every life that had been ruined. Raphael had finally found the courage to expose it all. But the ship sank. The ship was sabotaged." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Eloise felt the book slip from her nerveless fingers, the sound of it hitting the floor unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "You," she whispered. Thomas smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, it was a genuine expression, warm and proud and terrible. "Me. I spent months learning about explosives, about ship engines, about exactly how much damage it would take to ensure the vessel went down, but slowly enough for the crew to have a chance at survival. I didn't want to be a mass murderer, you understand. I just wanted to stop my dear brother from destroying the only thing that made our father's cruelty worthwhile. The Montenegro name. The Montenegro power. The Montenegro resources. The ability to shape the world according to our will. Thomas bent to retrieve the book, his movements careful and deliberate. Raphael thought he was being noble, exposing the truth. But the truth would have destroyed everything we had built. Every employee who depended on Montenegro shipping for their livelihood. Every charity that received our donations. Every community that relied on our investments. He was going to burn it all down to ease his own guilt. Eloise found herself backing toward the door, her mind reeling from the casual way he spoke of attempted murder. You could have killed him. I could have. Should have, perhaps. But I'm not a killer by nature, Miss Clayton. I'm a problem solver. And Raphael, damaged and guilt-ridden and confined to this house, was no longer a problem. He was neutralized. Until now. Thomas's eyes sharpened. Yes, until now. Until you arrived and began stirring up old ghosts, old guilts, old dangerous ideas about justice and redemption. The threat in his voice was unmistakable now. Eloise reached the doorway and felt the solid wood of the frame against her back, reassuring in its solidity. He cares about you, Thomas continued conversationally. More than he's cared about anyone since Isabel died. That makes you dangerous, Miss Clayton. It makes you a catalyst for all the impulses I've spent 20 years helping him suppress. Raphael doesn't know, does he? Eloise realized. He doesn't know you sabotaged the ship. He suspects. Deep down, I think he's always suspected. But he's never asked the question directly because he's afraid of what the answer might be. It's easier to blame fate, or his own carelessness or divine punishment for his sins. It's harder to acknowledge that his own brother tried to kill him. Half-brother, Eloise corrected without thinking. Thomas laughed, a sound that was almost musical in its genuine amusement. Yes, half-brother, though we share more than just blood, I'm afraid. We are both men shaped by the Montenegro legacy, both products of Don Montenegro's particular brand of cruelty. The difference is that I've learned to embrace what we are, while Raphael still fights against it. What we are? Predators, Thomas said simply. Men who take what we want and justify it afterward. The only difference between us and our father is that we're more subtle about it. Before Eloise could respond, the sound of wheels on marble announced Raphael's approach. Thomas stepped back smoothly, his expression shifting into the bland deference she had observed in him before. Miss Clayton was just reading about the family history, he said, as Raphael appeared in the doorway. I thought she might find the maritime records interesting. Raphael's eyes moved between them, taking in Eloise's pale face and defensive posture, Thomas's too casual stance. Thomas, I believe Mrs. Pemberton needs your assistance in the gardens. It was clearly a dismissal, but Thomas didn't move immediately. Instead, he looked directly at Eloise, and she saw something in his pale eyes that made her blood run cold. A promise, or perhaps a warning. Of course, he said finally. I'll leave you both to your research. He left the room with that same graceful step, but Eloise found herself listening to his footsteps long after they should have faded, as if he might be lingering just out of sight. What did he say to you? Raphael asked, moving his wheelchair closer to where she still stood pressed against the doorframe. He told me about the ship, Eloise said, her voice barely above a whisper. About the documents you were taking to Germany. Raphael went very still. What about them? He said the ship was sabotaged. He said he did it. The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the wind outside, the distant crash of waves against the cliffs, the subtle settling sounds of the ancient house around them. Raphael's face had gone completely white, and his hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair with enough force that she could see the tendons standing out on his wrists. He told you that? He said finally. He seemed proud of it, like it was an accomplishment he'd been waiting 20 years to share with someone. Raphael closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked older than his years, worn down by decades of guilt and secrets and careful self-control. When he opened them again, the grey eyes were filled with something that might have been relief. I wondered, he said quietly. For 20 years I wondered. The explosion didn't feel random, too precise, too perfectly timed. But I told myself it was paranoia, guilt making me see conspiracies where there was only bad luck. You never confronted him? How could I? On what grounds? My suspicions, My guilt-driven fantasies? Raphael shook his head. Besides, if I was right, if Thomas had tried to kill me, then I had no one to blame but myself. I had created the situation that drove him to it. That's not how it works, Eloise said, moving away from the doorframe to kneel beside his chair. The impulse to comfort him overrode her fear, her confusion, her growing awareness that she was trapped in a house with at least one person who had already proven capable of murder. You can't be responsible for other people's choices, Raphael. Not Thomas's, not Isabel's, not even your father's. He looked down at her, and she was struck again by the intensity of his gaze, the way he seemed to see straight through all her defenses to something essential underneath. Can't I? He asked. I made choices too, Eloise. I chose to stay silent about my father's cruelties for years. I chose to prioritize my own comfort over justice for the people he hurt. I chose to threaten Isabel with institutionalization rather than listen to her demands for truth. Every choice has consequences, and I've been living with mine for 2 decades. And now? Now I have a choice to make about you. The words sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. She was acutely aware of their proximity, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the way the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows turned his dark hair silver at the temples. What choice? Whether to let you leave before you get hurt, or to be selfish enough to ask you to stay, knowing what that might cost both of us. The honesty in his voice was devastating. She could see the war being fought behind his eyes, desire against responsibility, longing against the hard-learned lessons of a lifetime spent watching the Montenegro name destroy everything it touched. What if the choice isn't yours to make? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Isn't it? I'm not a child, Raphael. I'm not some naive girl who stumbled into your house by accident. I came here with my own agenda, my own desire for truth. Maybe it's time you stopped trying to protect me from consequences I knew I might face. Something shifted in his expression, a wall coming down that she hadn't even realized was there. Suddenly he was closer, leaning forward in his chair until she could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes, could smell the scent of leather and horses and something uniquely him. You don't know what you're saying, he said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. More want, don't I? She reached up and touched his face, her palm against his cheek, feeling the roughness of stubble and the warmth of skin that seemed to burn against her fingers. He closed his eyes and leaned into the touch, and she could feel some of the rigid control he maintained beginning to crack. Eloise. Her name on his lips was half prayer, half warning. I'm not going anywhere, she said, and as the words left her mouth, she realized they were true. Whatever games Thomas was playing, whatever dangers lurked in the shadows of this house, whatever price she might ultimately pay for staying, none of it mattered as much as the man in front of her. The complex, damaged, fascinating man who had somehow become essential to her in the space of a week. When he kissed her, it was with a desperation that spoke of 20 years of isolation, of longing suppressed and desire denied. His hands tangled in her hair, and she could taste the salt air on his lips, could feel the tremor in his fingers that spoke of how carefully he had been holding himself back. The kiss deepened, became something fierce and claiming, and she found herself responding with an intensity that surprised her. This wasn't the gentle romance she had read about in books or seen in films. This was something raw, more honest, built on mutual damage and shared secrets and the recognition that they were both standing at the edge of an abyss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Raphael rested his forehead against hers and closed his eyes. God help us both, he whispered. Before Eloise could respond, the sound of footsteps in the corridor made them spring apart. Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral despite what she must have observed. Dinner will be ready in an hour, she said, as if she had seen nothing unusual. And Thomas asked me to tell you that there's a storm coming in from the Atlantic. The roads may be impassable by morning. The words hung in the air after she left, loaded with implications that neither of them wanted to examine too closely. Eloise looked toward the windows and realized that the afternoon light had taken on that peculiar quality that preceded severe weather. A yellow-green tinge that made everything look unreal, dreamlike. She's right, Raphael said, following her gaze. The weather can change quickly here. These coastal storms can be intense. Convenient timing, Eloise observed, and saw something flicker in his expression. You think Thomas planned this? I think Thomas is more than he appears to be. I think he's been manipulating events in this house for longer than either of us realizes, and I think we need to be very careful about what we say and do while we're trapped here with him. Raphael was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Finally, he nodded grimly. You're right. But Eloise, if Thomas feels threatened, if he thinks we're getting too close to truths he'd rather keep buried. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Then we need to be smarter than he is. Thomas has had 20 years to perfect his strategies, 20 years to study this house, to understand every advantage it gives him. We're on his territory now. But we have something he doesn't, Eloise pointed out. What's that? Each other. The simple truth of it settled between them like a pact. Whatever happened over the next few days, whatever Thomas had planned, whatever secret still lay buried in the walls of Raven's Hollow Manor, they would face it together. As if summoned by their conversation, the first rumble of thunder rolled across the moors. The storm was coming, and with it, whatever reckoning Thomas had been building toward for 20 years. That evening's dinner was a tense affair. Thomas joined them at the table, something he had never done before, appearing in formal clothes that transformed him from groundskeeper to gentleman. Sitting there in his well-tailored jacket and crisp white shirt, it was impossible to ignore the family resemblance between him and Raphael. The same strong jaw, the same intelligent eyes, the same air of aristocratic bearing that marked them both as Montenegros, regardless of legitimacy. The conversation was carefully polite, touching on safe subjects like the weather and local news, but underneath the civility ran currents of tension that made every exchange feel loaded with hidden meaning. Mrs. Pemberton served the courses with her usual silent efficiency, but Eloise noticed the way the housekeeper's eyes darted between the three of them, as if she too sensed that something significant was building. The storm should reach us within the hour, Thomas observed over the main course. The meteorological services are predicting winds of up to 80 miles per hour. The power will almost certainly go out. We have the generator, Raphael replied evenly. Yes, though it's been somewhat unreliable lately. I've been meaning to have it serviced, but with one thing and another, Thomas shrugged elegantly. Well, we may find ourselves dependent on candles and the fireplaces for warmth. How atmospheric, Eloise said, and was rewarded with a sharp look from Thomas's pale eyes. Indeed, there's something about storms that brings out the truth in people, don't you think? All our careful pretenses get stripped away when we're reduced to the most basic human needs. And what truths might those be? Raphael asked, his voice deceptively casual. Thomas smiled, that same warm, terrible expression Eloise had seen in the library. Oh, I think we all know the answer to that. The truth about family loyalty. About what we're willing to sacrifice to protect the things that matter most to us. About how far we'll go to preserve what's ours. The lights flickered as he spoke, as if the storm was announcing its arrival. Outside, the wind had picked up significantly, rattling the windows and sending tree branches scraping against the glass like skeletal fingers. Perhaps we should retire to the study, Raphael suggested. The fireplace there will provide adequate warmth if we do lose power. Excellent suggestion, Thomas agreed. I'll ask Mrs. Pemberton to bring some candles just in case. As they made their way through the corridors, Eloise couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The house felt different somehow, more alive, more watchful. The portraits on the walls seemed to follow their movements with increased intensity, and the shadows cast by the flickering lights danced like living things. The study, at least, felt more secure. Raphael built up the fire while Thomas arranged chairs in a semicircle around the hearth. Mrs. Pemberton appeared with an armload of candles and oil lamps, distributing them around the room with practiced efficiency. Will there be anything else? She asked, and something in her tone suggested she was asking more than the surface question implied. I think we'll be fine, Raphael said, but his eyes met hers with a look that might have been understanding. After she left, they settled into their chairs with brandy and an atmosphere of expectation that felt almost electrical. The storm was building outside, the wind howling around the house with increasing violence, and with each flash of lightning, the room was illuminated in stark black and white like a photograph. This house has seen many storms, Thomas said conversationally, swirling his brandy in its crystal snifter. Some meteorological, some metaphorical. The walls have absorbed so much drama over the centuries. Sometimes I think they remember it all. Every argument, every confession, every moment of passion or violence. You sound like Isabel, Raphael observed. She used to say the house was haunted by its own history. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the dead never really leave us. They just find new ways to make their presence known. As if on cue, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into the flickering orange glow of candlelight. The sudden darkness seemed to change the quality of the air itself, making it feel thicker, more charged with possibility. "Well," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly in the new silence, "it seems we're at the mercy of more primitive forms of illumination. How fitting." He rose from his chair and moved to the bookshelf, retrieving something from behind a row of volumes. When he returned to the circle of firelight, he was carrying a wooden box that Eloise didn't recognize. "What's that?" she asked, though something in her chest already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. "A few items I've been saving for an occasion like this," Thomas replied, setting the box on the small table between their chairs. "Things that belong to our father, things that Raphael has never seen but probably should have." He opened the box with deliberate ceremony, revealing a collection of papers, photographs, and what looked like pieces of jewelry. The candlelight caught the gold of rings and brooches, the silver of lockets, the gleam of precious stones. "Trophies," Thomas continued, his voice soft and almost hypnotic. Don Montenegro kept a memento from each of his conquests, each woman whose life he touched, each family he destroyed. He was quite sentimental that way. Raphael had gone very still, his face carved from stone in the firelight. "Where did you get those?" "From his private safe. The one hidden behind the portrait in his study upstairs. I've had access to it since he died, but I thought it best to wait for the right moment to share the contents." Thomas reached into the box and withdrew a small silver locket, holding it up so the candlelight could catch its surface. This belonged to a seamstress named Margaret Hartwell. She worked in a shop in Whitechapel, very talented with her needle, very beautiful despite her humble circumstances. Eloise felt the blood drain from her face. That was her grandmother's locket, the one she had worn in the single photograph Eloise possessed of her as a young woman. "He kept it?" she whispered. "He kept something from all of them," Thomas confirmed. "But this one was special, not just because she was carrying his grandchild, but because she was the one who got away, the one who disappeared before he could properly dispose of her." He set the locket on the table and reached for another item, a letter with familiar handwriting. "This is the last letter Raphael wrote to her, the one that was never delivered. Our father intercepted it, kept it as evidence of his son's foolish sentiment." "Why are you showing us this?" Raphael demanded, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Because I want you to understand what we are," Thomas replied. "I want you to see that your recent attack of conscience, your desire to make amends for the family's sins, is nothing more than naive romanticism. We are what we are, Raphael. We are Montenegros. We take what we want. We keep what serves us and we discard what becomes inconvenient. It's not cruelty. It's simply our nature." Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, and in that stark white light, Eloise saw something in Thomas's expression that chilled her to the bone. This wasn't just about family history or legacy protection. This was personal. You loved her, she realized suddenly. "My grandmother. You were in love with her too." The silence that followed was broken only by the storm outside and the crackling of the fire. Thomas sat very still, his pale eyes reflecting the candlelight like mirrors. "I was 12 when she came to work in the house," he said finally. "Old enough to appreciate beauty, young enough to believe in fairy tales. She was kind to me, one of the few people who ever was. When she looked at me, she didn't see the bastard son or the shameful secret. She saw a lonely child who needed gentleness. Thomas, she would bring me books from the library, read to me in the garden when my tutors were finished for the day. She taught me to see poetry and mathematics, beauty in the natural world. For 6 months she made me believe that I might be worth something more than my father's grudging tolerance." The pain in his voice was raw, honest, devastating. Eloise found herself feeling sorry for him, despite everything she now knew about what he was capable of. "And then she fell in love with Raphael," she said quietly. "And then she fell in love with Raphael," Thomas confirmed. Suddenly she had no time for a lonely child. Suddenly her gentle smiles were reserved for someone else. And when the scandal broke, when she disappeared in the night, I understood for the first time how the world really worked. You were a child, Raphael said. You can't have understood. I understood perfectly, Thomas cut him off. I understood that love is a luxury the powerless cannot afford. I understood that kindness is a weapon that can be withdrawn at any moment. And I understood that the only way to protect yourself from that kind of pain is to make sure you're never vulnerable again. The room fell silent, except for the storm. Outside, the wind had reached a howling crescendo, and the house creaked and groaned around them like a ship in heavy seas. The candle flames danced wildly, casting moving shadows on the walls that seemed to writhe with life. So you've spent your entire life making sure no one could hurt you again, Eloise said, even if it meant hurting others first. Exactly, Thomas smiled, but there was no warmth in it now. And it's worked beautifully. For 20 years I've controlled every variable in this house. I've made sure that Raphael remained isolated, guilt-ridden, unable to act on his periodic impulses toward heroism. I've made sure that the Montenegro legacy remained intact, that our resources continued to grow, that our power remained undiminished. And now? Now you've arrived and disrupted everything. You've given Raphael something to care about again, something to fight for. You've rekindled all those dangerous impulses toward justice and redemption that I worked so hard to suppress. Thomas reached into the box again and withdrew something that made both Raphael and Eloise freeze, a small, silver pistol that gleamed dully in the candlelight. So I find myself faced with a choice, he continued conversationally. Allow you to continue this disruption, knowing that it will eventually destroy everything I've worked to preserve, or take steps to ensure that the status quo remains unchanged. Thomas, Raphael said carefully, put the gun down. Whatever you're thinking. I'm thinking that history has a tendency to repeat itself, Thomas replied. 40 years ago, our father faced a similar dilemma with your grandmother, a woman who threatened the family stability, who represented a danger to everything we had built. He handled it quietly, efficiently, with minimal disruption to the established order. He didn't kill her, Eloise said, though her voice was barely above a whisper. Didn't he? Oh, not literally, perhaps. But he destroyed everything that made her who she was. He took away her love, her hope, her future. What he left behind was just a shadow, a broken woman who spent the rest of her life afraid of her own memories. Thomas rose from his chair, the pistol held loosely in his right hand. In the flickering candlelight, he looked like something out of a Gothic novel, pale, elegant, beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful. I have no desire to be so crude, he continued. But the storm provides such perfect cover, doesn't it? A tragic accident during the power outage. Perhaps Miss Clayton fell from the cliff path while trying to leave in the night. Perhaps she struck her head in the darkness. Such things happen during storms. You're insane, Raphael said, but his voice was steady, controlled. Eloise could see him calculating distances, angles, possibilities for action, despite his limitations. I'm practical, Thomas corrected. Insanity would be allowing sentiment to destroy everything our family has built. Insanity would be letting history repeat itself, with another Montenegro man falling in love with another inappropriate woman. She's not inappropriate, Raphael said quietly, and something in his tone made Thomas pause. Isn't she? A granddaughter of servants, a woman with no fortune, no connections, no ability to enhance the Montenegro position in society. She's perfect. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with truth and defiance and something that might have been love. Eloise felt her heart stop, restart, begin beating again at twice its normal speed. Perfect, Thomas repeated, and his laugh was like breaking glass. Just what our father said about Margaret Hartwell. Just what led to 20 years of guilt and self-destruction and wasted potential. Then maybe it's time to break the cycle, Raphael said. He moved then, faster than Eloise would have thought possible for a man in a wheelchair. The chair shot forward, ramming into Thomas's legs and sending him stumbling, backward. The pistol went off, the sound unnaturally loud in the enclosed space, and plaster rained down from the ceiling where the bullet had struck. For a moment, all was chaos. Thomas struggled to regain his balance. Raphael fought to maneuver his chair for another attack, and Eloise found herself moving without conscious thought. grabbing one of the heavy brass candlesticks from the table and swinging it at Thomas's wrist. The impact sent the pistol flying across the room, and Thomas cried out in pain and fury. But before any of them could react further, a new voice cut through the confusion like a blade. "That's quite enough." They all turned to see Mrs. Pemberton standing in the doorway, her grey hair disheveled by the wind, but her expression calm and determined. In her hands, she held a much larger pistol than the one Thomas had been brandishing, an old military revolver that looked like it could blow a hole through a stone wall. "Mrs. Pemberton," Thomas said, his voice carefully controlled despite the obvious pain in his wrist, "this doesn't concern you." "Oh, but it does," the housekeeper replied, stepping fully into the room. "You see, I've been protecting this family for 23 years, protecting it from outside threats, from internal conflicts, and most especially from its own worst impulses." She looked directly at Thomas, and her expression was almost maternal, despite the deadly weapon in her hands. "I've watched you, Thomas Montenegro, ever since you were a bitter child plotting revenge against the world that rejected you. I've cleaned up your messes, covered your tracks, enabled your schemes because I believed they served the greater good. But this," she gestured at the scene before her, "this is not protection. This is destruction. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. You're so afraid of losing control, so terrified of being abandoned again, that you're willing to destroy the one person who might actually be able to heal this family's wounds." Mrs. Pemberton's gaze shifted to include both Raphael and Eloise. "Did you think I didn't see what was happening? Did you think I didn't recognize the signs? This girl isn't a threat to the Montenegro legacy. She's its salvation." The wind outside had reached a screaming crescendo, rattling the windows so violently that Eloise was surprised they didn't shatter. The candlelight flickered wildly, casting shifting shadows that made the whole scene feel unreal, dreamlike. "What are you saying?" Raphael asked. Mrs. Pemberton smiled, and for the first time since Eloise had met her, the expression transformed her face into something warm and almost beautiful. "I'm saying it's time for the truth. All of it. The truth about Thomas's parentage, about Isabel's death, about the accident that changed your life, and, most importantly, the truth about why Eloise Clayton was always meant to come to this house." Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, and in that stark white light, Eloise saw something that made her blood run cold. On the table beside Thomas's box of trophies, her grandmother's locket had fallen open, revealing a tiny photograph inside, a photograph of a baby that looked exactly like Eloise herself had looked as an infant. "The child didn't die," she whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. Mrs. Pemberton nodded gravely. "Margaret Hartwell's son lived, and grew up, and had children of his own." The room seemed to spin around Eloise as the implications crashed over her like a tide. If her grandmother's child had lived, if that child was her parent, then she wasn't just connected to the Montenegro family through her grandmother's tragic love affair. She was a Montenegro herself. The silence that followed Mrs. Pemberton's revelation was profound. Broken only by the storm's relentless assault on the house, Eloise felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet, as if everything she had believed about herself, her family, her very identity, had crumbled to dust in an instant. "That's impossible," she whispered. But even as she spoke the words, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began falling into place. Her grandmother's evasiveness about the past, her mother's mysterious reluctance to speak of her father, the way certain questions about family history had always been deflected or ignored. Mrs. Pemberton kept the revolver trained on Thomas, who remained frozen beside the overturned chair, clutching his injured wrist. But her voice when she spoke was gentle, almost motherly. "Your grandmother was 19 when she came to work here, Miss Clayton. 19 and beautiful and full of hope. She fell in love with Raphael, the young man, not the master of the house he would become. And when she discovered she was carrying his child, she believed they would find a way to be together despite the obstacles." "But my father said," Raphael began. "Your father lied," Mrs. Pemberton cut him off sharply. "About many things, but especially about this. He didn't pay Margaret to disappear. He had her kidnapped." The room seemed to contract around those words, the candlelight flickering as if the flames themselves were shocked by the admission. Outside, thunder crashed with such violence that the windows rattled in their frames. Kidnapped? Eloise's voice was barely audible. 3 men came in the night, Mrs. Pemberton continued, her eyes never leaving Thomas. Dragged her from her bed at the boarding house where she was staying. She was 6 months pregnant, terrified, alone. They brought her to a house outside Manchester, a private clinic that specialized in discretion. A clinic for what? Raphael demanded. For wealthy men who needed their inconvenient problems solved quietly. Don Montenegro had used their services before, you see. Other women, other complications. The usual procedure was simple. The woman would be kept until she delivered. The child would be taken immediately, and the mother would be released with enough money to disappear permanently. Eloise felt sick. The room was spinning around her, the candlelight blurring into streaks of gold and shadow. What happened to the baby? What happened to him? The doctor was supposed to tell Margaret the child had died, Mrs. Pemberton said. That was always the story. But this doctor, this particular man, he had been selling healthy infants to wealthy families who couldn't have children of their own. He saw an opportunity. Thomas had gone very still, his pale eyes fixed on Mrs. Pemberton with an intensity that suggested he was hearing some of this for the first time as well. The baby was sold. Raphael's voice was hollow. To a family named Clayton. Good people, childless after 10 years of marriage, wealthy enough to pay handsomely for a healthy infant and ask no questions about its origins. They raised the boy as their own son, never knowing he was a Montenegro. And my grandmother believed her child was dead. The trauma of losing him, combined with everything else your father had put her through, left her broken. She never fully recovered. When she was finally released from the clinic, she was a shadow of the woman who had entered it. The pieces were falling together now, creating a picture so horrific that Eloise could barely comprehend it. Her grandfather, the man she had never known who had died when she was an infant, had been Raphael's son, which made her— "You're not blood-related," Mrs. Pemberton said, as if reading her thoughts. The child Margaret carried was Raphael's, yes, but Raphael himself was adopted. The statement hit the room like a physical blow. Even Thomas straightened, his careful composure cracking for the first time. "What did you say?" Raphael whispered. "Did you never wonder why you looked so different from your father? Why your temperament was so unlike his? Don Montenegro was not your biological father, Raphael. You were the first of his acquisitions, taken from a young servant girl who died in childbirth, raised as his heir because his wife was barren, and he needed someone to carry on the Montenegro name." The revelation reverberated through the room like aftershocks from an earthquake. Eloise watched Raphael's face cycle through disbelief, shock, and something that might have been relief. Then Thomas's, she began. "The only biological Montenegro in this room," Mrs. Pemberton confirmed. "The irony is exquisite, isn't it? The bastard son is the true heir, while the acknowledged son is no more legitimate than any foundling." Thomas laughed, but it was a sound devoid of humor, sharp and bitter as winter wind. "All these years," he said, "all these years I've tortured myself with resentment over my illegitimate status, when I was the only real Montenegro of us all." "It doesn't matter," Raphael said quietly, but Eloise could see the way his hands shook as he gripped the arms of his wheelchair. "Blood doesn't make a family. Actions do. Choices do." "Spoken like someone who's just learned he's not who he thought he was," Thomas replied. "But you're wrong, brother. Blood is everything. It's the only thing that truly matters in this world." Mrs. Pemberton shifted slightly, the revolver still trained on Thomas, but her attention partly on Raphael and Eloise. "There's more," she said. "Things you need to know about why I've stayed in this house for so long, why I've protected this family despite everything I've seen." "More secrets?" Eloise asked, though she wasn't sure she could handle any additional revelations. "I am Margaret's sister." The words hung in the air like a curse. Eloise stared at the older woman, trying to see some resemblance to the grandmother she remembered. But Mrs. Pemberton's grey hair and stern features bore no obvious similarity to Margaret's gentle beauty. "Her older sister," Mrs. Pemberton continued, 5 years older and already in service when Margaret came to London. "I was working as a lady's maid for a family in Mayfair when I heard she had found employment with the Montenegros. I knew the reputation of the family, knew the dangers, but Margaret was headstrong. She wouldn't listen to my warnings. So you came here, Raphael said, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. After she disappeared, yes. I applied for the position of housekeeper, thinking I might discover what had happened to her. Don Montenegro hired me without question. He enjoyed having people in his employ who had reasons to remain silent about family secrets. And you've been here ever since. 23 years of watching. Waiting, protecting what I could. I was there when Isabel began showing signs of instability. I was there when you started questioning your father's methods. I was there when Thomas began his long campaign of manipulation and control. She looked directly at Thomas, and her expression was almost pitying. Did you think I didn't know? Did you think I didn't see what you were doing? The careful poisoning of Raphael's confidence, the subtle sabotage of any relationship that might threaten your control over him, the gradual isolation that made him dependent on your presence. You knew about the ship? Raphael asked. I suspected, but I had no proof, and by then the damage was done. You were crippled, guilt-ridden, convinced that you deserved whatever suffering came your way. Thomas had achieved his goal. Thomas had been listening to this recitation with growing agitation, his pale eyes darting between the revolver in Mrs. Pemberton's hands and the positions of everyone in the room. Eloise could see him calculating, looking for opportunities, waiting for a moment of inattention. None of this changes anything, he said finally. Blood relation or not, Raphael is still weak, still prone to romantic fantasies that could destroy everything we've built. And she, he gestured at Eloise, is still a threat to the stability of this family. What stability? Raphael demanded. What family? You've turned this house into a mausoleum, Thomas. You've isolated us from the world, built walls of guilt and secrecy that serve no one but your own fear of change. I've preserved what matters, Thomas shot back. The Montenegro fortune, the Montenegro influence, the ability to shape events according to our will. Without that, what are we? What do any of us matter? Perhaps it's time to find out, Eloise said quietly. Both men looked at her, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical pressure. But she also felt something else, a strength she hadn't known she possessed, a certainty that came from finally understanding her place in this twisted family history. All my life, she continued, I've felt like something was missing, like there was a part of me that didn't quite fit with the rest of the world. My grandmother raised me with love, but there was always this sense of sadness around her, this feeling that she was carrying some tremendous loss, and now I know why. She stood up, surprising herself with how steady her voice was, despite the chaos of revelations still swirling in her mind. She never got to raise her own son. She never got to see him grow up, never got to know his children. That grief shaped everything about how she saw the world, how she raised me. She was so afraid of losing people that she never let herself truly love anyone again. Eloise, Raphael said softly. But I'm not her, Eloise continued, looking directly at him. I'm not broken by the past. I don't have to carry her fears or her limitations, and neither do you. The storm outside seemed to pause as if nature itself was listening to her words. In the sudden relative quiet, the crackling of the fire sounded unnaturally loud. What are you saying? Thomas asked, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. I'm saying that maybe it's time to stop letting the dead define how the living should exist, Eloise replied. Your father, both your fathers apparently, made choices that hurt people, but that doesn't mean we have to keep making those same choices. It doesn't mean we have to keep perpetuating their cruelties. Pretty words, Thomas said, but words don't change the fundamental nature of power. Words don't alter the fact that this family has responsibilities, obligations that transcend individual happiness. What responsibilities? Raphael asked. To whom? The Montenegro name is already tainted, Thomas. The shipping company collapsed years ago. The fortune is built on generations of exploitation and cruelty. What exactly are we preserving? The potential for influence, Thomas replied. The ability to shape events, to control outcomes. You may be content to waste away in this house feeling sorry for yourself, but I have plans. Projects that require the Montenegro resources, the Montenegro connections. What plans? Mrs. Pemberton demanded, and something in her tone suggested she knew more than she was saying. Thomas hesitated, his eyes flicking between the revolver and the faces watching him. Finally, he seemed to come to some internal decision. Why do you think I've spent 20 years carefully managing our investments? Why do you think I've maintained relationships with shipping companies, government officials, law enforcement agencies? The Montenegro name may be diminished, but it's not forgotten. And there are still opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. What kind of opportunities? Eloise asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know the answer. The same kind our ancestors built their fortunes on, Thomas said, with a smile that was all sharp edges. The movement of goods that governments prefer not to see, the transportation of people who need to disappear, the facilitation of transactions that require absolute discretion. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Raphael's face had gone white, and Mrs. Pemberton's grip on the revolver had tightened visibly. "You're talking about smuggling," Raphael said. "Human trafficking." "I'm talking about providing services that people are willing to pay handsomely for," Thomas corrected. "The morality is irrelevant. What matters is the profit margin and the sustainability of the operation." "My God," Eloise whispered. "You're not just preserving your father's legacy. You're expanding it." "I'm ensuring its survival," Thomas replied, "and I've been very successful. Do you think the repairs to this house, the maintenance of our lifestyle, the resources I've had available for my various projects, do you think all of that comes from legitimate investments? The Montenegro fortune would have disappeared decades ago without new sources of income." The revelation hit Eloise like a physical blow. Every comfort she had enjoyed since arriving at the house, every meal, every warm room, every candle now flickering around them, of it funded by activities that were probably destroying lives just as surely as Dante. Montenegro's original cruelties had destroyed her. Grandmother. That's why you couldn't let Raphael expose the family's past, she realized. Not because of shame or reputation, but because it would have drawn attention to your current activities. Exactly. And it's why I can't allow this romance to continue. Raphael has already shown a dangerous tendency toward conscience. Add a woman who inspires his better angels, and it's only a matter of time before he starts asking inconvenient questions about our current income streams. Thomas began moving slowly, carefully circling around the room while keeping his eyes on Mrs. Pemberton. The housekeeper tracked him with the revolver, but Eloise could see that she was torn between multiple targets, unsure where the greatest threat might come from. But all of this could be resolved so simply, Thomas continued, his voice taking on that hypnotic quality she had noticed in the library. A tragic accident during the storm. Miss Clayton's body found at the bottom of the cliffs, clearly the victim of a fall in the dark. Raphael, overcome with grief, becomes even more dependent on my guidance. The status quo is maintained, the business continues to prosper, and everyone who matters survives to see another day. "I won't let you hurt her," Raphael said, and there was steel in his voice that Eloise had never heard before. "And how exactly will you stop me?" Thomas asked. "You're crippled, trapped in that chair, dependent on others for the most basic functions. What can you possibly do to protect anyone?" But Raphael was already moving, his powerful arms propelling the wheelchair forward with startling speed. This time, however, Thomas was ready for him. He stepped aside at the last moment, grabbing one of the heavy andirons from beside the fireplace and swinging it at Raphael's head. The sound of metal connecting with skull was sickening. Raphael slumped forward in his chair, blood trickling from a gash above his left temple, and for a horrible moment, Eloise thought he might be dead. "Raphael." She started toward him, but Thomas's voice stopped her. "Stay where you are, Miss Clayton, unless you'd like to join him." Thomas had retrieved the iron poker from beside the fireplace, a weapon that looked capable of crushing skulls or breaking bones with equal efficiency. He held it casually, but Eloise could see the tension in his shoulders, the barely contained violence in his pale eyes. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said without looking away from Eloise, "I think it's time you made a choice. You've served this family loyally for over 20 years. Are you going to let one evening's sentimentality destroy everything we've built together?" The older woman's face was a mask of conflict. The revolver wavered in her hands as she looked between Thomas and the unconscious Raphael. "You're right that I've served this family," she said finally, "but I've served it for reasons you don't understand. I didn't stay here to protect the Montenegro fortune or to enable your criminal enterprises. I stayed to ensure that someday, somehow, justice might finally be done for what was taken from my sister." "Your sister got exactly what she deserved," Thomas replied coldly. "She was a servant who forgot her place, a woman who thought she could climb above her station by spreading her legs for the master's son. The fact that she suffered for her presumption is entirely appropriate." The gun in Mrs. Pemberton's hands stopped wavering. When she spoke, her voice was as cold and steady as winter stone. "Margaret was 17 when she came to this house. 17 and innocent and trusting. She believed in love, in the possibility of redemption, in the idea that good people would ultimately triumph over evil. Your father destroyed that innocence systematically, deliberately, for no reason other than his own cruelty. And now you want revenge?" Thomas asked. "After all these years, you want to balance the scales." "I want my great-niece to have the chance at happiness that was stolen from her grandmother," Mrs. Pemberton replied. "I want her to be able to love without fear, to build a life without shadows, to break the cycle of pain that has defined this family for 3 generations." Thomas laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "Touching, but ultimately irrelevant. Even if you could bring yourself to shoot me, which I doubt, what then? Raphael is injured, possibly dying. Miss Clayton is alone in a house with no way to communicate with the outside world, no transportation, no resources. Even if she survives the immediate crisis, what kind of life awaits her? What kind of future?" He was moving again, slowly circling the room, forcing Mrs. Pemberton to track him, while staying far enough away that she couldn't be certain of hitting him with the antique revolver. "You see, I've planned for every contingency," he continued. "The storm will provide cover for whatever needs to happen tonight. By morning, when the roads are clear again, there will be a plausible story for whatever authorities might come calling, and life will go on as it always has." But as he spoke, something was happening that none of them had noticed. Raphael's eyes had opened, and he was moving his right hand slowly, carefully, reaching for something that had fallen beside his wheelchair during the struggle. Thomas's small pistol, the one that had been knocked across the room earlier, was lying just within reach. Eloise saw it first and felt her heart leap into her throat. She forced herself to maintain eye contact with Thomas, to give no sign of what she had observed, while Raphael's fingers closed around the weapon's grip. "You're wrong about one thing," she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "You haven't planned for every contingency." "Haven't I?" Thomas asked, amused. "What have I missed? You've forgotten that some people are willing to sacrifice everything for love." She moved then, throwing herself directly at Thomas with no regard for the poker in his hands or the damage it might do. Her only thought was to create enough chaos, enough distraction, that Raphael might have a chance to use the weapon he had retrieved. Thomas tried to bring the poker up to defend himself, but her momentum carried them both backward into the bookshelf. Heavy volumes rained down around them as they struggled, and Eloise felt a sharp pain as the poker caught her shoulder, sending fire down her left arm. But the distraction had worked. Raphael, fighting through what must have been tremendous pain from his head wound, had managed to raise the pistol and fire. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Thomas stiffened, looked down at the spreading red stain on his white shirt, and then crumpled to the floor with an expression of profound surprise. For a moment, no one moved. The storm outside seemed to have paused again, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then Mrs. Pemberton rushed to Raphael's side, checking his head wound while Eloise knelt beside Thomas. He was still alive, but barely. Blood frothed at the corners of his mouth, and his pale eyes had lost their focus. "The papers," he whispered. "Hidden. Behind the Height portrait." "What papers?" Eloise asked, leaning closer. "Evidence. Of everything. All the families. All the crimes." His voice was growing weaker, but he seemed desperate to get the words out. "Why are you telling me this?" Thomas tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. Maybe I'm tired of being the villain." His eyes closed, and for a moment Eloise thought he was gone, but then they opened again and he was looking directly at her with something that might have been regret. Margaret, she was the only one who was ever kind. This time, when his eyes closed, they didn't open again. Eloise sat back on her heels, staring at the man who had terrorized them, manipulated them, tried to kill them, and who had, in his final moments, shown a flicker of the lonely child he had once been. "Is he?" Raphael asked, his voice slurred from the head injury. "Yes," Mrs. Pemberton confirmed, checking for a pulse. "He's gone." The three of them sat in silence, processing what had just happened. Outside, the storm was beginning to calm, the howling wind dying to a steady whisper. The candles had burned low during the confrontation, and the room was filled with dancing shadows that seemed almost peaceful after the violence. "What do we do now?" Eloise asked. "Now we clean up the mess," Mrs. Pemberton said practically, "and we decide what kind of future we want to build from the ashes of the past." Raphael had managed to wheel himself closer to where Eloise sat. Despite his injury, despite everything they had just been through, his eyes were clear and focused on her face. "Are you hurt?" he asked, reaching out to touch the shoulder where the poker had struck her. "I'm fine," she said, though she could feel bruises already forming. "Are you?" "I will be." He took her hand in his and she felt the tremor in his fingers. Whether from pain, shock, or emotion, she couldn't tell. "Eloise, about what Mrs. Pemberton said about us not being blood-related. Does it matter?" She asked. "Whatever connection we have, whatever brought us together, isn't the important thing that we're here now. It matters because I love you," Raphael said simply, "and I want to know if I have the right to say that." The words hit her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. After everything they had been through, after all the revelations and violence and fear, the simple declaration of love felt like a miracle. "You have the right," she said, "and I love you too." Mrs. Pemberton had been moving around the room, gathering evidence and beginning the process of organizing their story for the authorities who would eventually come. But she paused when she heard their exchange, and for the first time since Eloise had met her, the older woman smiled with genuine warmth. "Margaret would have been so happy," she said softly, "to know that her granddaughter found what was stolen from her, love without fear, hope without reservation." As if summoned by her words, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The shadows seemed to lighten, the air to clear, and Eloise could have sworn she felt a presence, gentle, loving, at peace, settling over them like a blessing. Outside, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to show through the windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind the clean, washed smell of rain and the promise of new beginnings. "What happens now?" Eloise asked, looking between Raphael and Mrs. Pemberton. "With the business Thomas was running, with the house, with everything?" "Now we make different choices," Raphael said. "We use whatever resources we have left to help the people our family has hurt. We expose Thomas's criminal activities and cooperate with the authorities to shut them down. And we try to build something better from what's left. It won't be easy," Mrs. Pemberton warned. "There will be investigations, probably criminal charges for anyone who was involved in Thomas's activities. The Montenegro name will be dragged through every newspaper in England." "Good," Raphael said firmly. "It's time for the truth to come to light. All of it." Eloise squeezed his hand, feeling the strength and determination in his grip. This was the man she had fallen in love with, not the bitter, isolated figure she had first encountered, but someone who was finally ready to face the consequences of his family's history and build something better from the wreckage. "There's something else," Mrs. Pemberton said, moving to the desk where Thomas had left his box of trophies. "These belongings he kept, they represent dozens of families who never knew what happened to their loved ones. Finding them, returning what can be returned, telling them the truth about what was done to them. It could take years." "Then we'll take years," Eloise said. "However long it takes." "We?" Raphael asked, and she could hear the hope in his voice. "We," she confirmed. "If you'll have me. If you want to face whatever comes next together." Instead of answering with words, Raphael pulled her down for a kiss that tasted of blood and smoke and the promise of redemption. When they finally broke apart, the room was filled with the golden light of morning, and Eloise could see clearly for the first time since her arrival at Ravenshollow Manor. The house around them was still dark, still full of shadows and secrets, and the accumulated pain of generations. But it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a place where healing might finally be possible. "Mrs. Pemberton," Raphael said, "would you call the local police? Tell them there's been an accident, and they'll need to send an ambulance and probably a detective as well." Of course. But are you certain about this? Once we involve the authorities, there will be no going back. No way to contain the story or control how it's told. Raphael looked around the room, at Thomas's body, at the scattered evidence of his crimes, at the portraits of Montenegro ancestors who had built their legacy on cruelty and exploitation. Then he looked at Eloise, and his expression was serene. "I'm tired of secrets," he said. "I'm tired of shame. I want to live in the light for whatever time we have left." As Mrs. Pemberton went to make the call, Eloise helped Raphael clean the blood from his head wound and check the extent of his injuries. They were both hurt, both exhausted, both traumatized by what they had experienced, but they were alive and they were together. And for the first time in either of their lives, the future stretched out before them full of possibilities instead of limitations. "Do you think she's at peace now?" Eloise asked, thinking of her grandmother. "Do you think she knows what happened here tonight?" Raphael was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think she knows," he said finally. "And I think she's glad that her granddaughter was strong enough to break the cycle she couldn't escape." Outside, they could hear the sound of vehicles approaching. The police Mrs. Pemberton had called, the ambulance that would treat their injuries, the officials who would begin the long process of unraveling Thomas's criminal enterprises and bringing justice to the families who had suffered under Montenegro cruelty. It would be messy, painful, public. There would be trials and investigations, and newspaper headlines that would make their names synonymous with scandal. They would lose their privacy, probably their fortune, certainly the comfortable isolation that had protected them from the consequences of their family's actions. But they would face it together, and they would face it honestly. And perhaps in the end, that would be enough to heal the wounds that had festered in darkness for far too long. As the first police officers entered the house, bringing with them the cold light of justice and the promise of accountability, Eloise took Raphael's hand and prepared to tell the truth at last. 6 months later, Eloise stood in the same study where Thomas had died. But the room had been transformed beyond recognition. The heavy curtains that had blocked the light for decades had been removed, replaced by simple white linen that allowed Yorkshire sunshine to flood the space. The dark mahogany furniture remained, but it no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it spoke of history acknowledged rather than shame concealed. The walls, once lined with portraits of Montenegro ancestors, now displayed something entirely different: photographs and documents that told the stories of the families they were working to heal. Pictures of children who had been separated from their parents, women who had disappeared into the night, men whose businesses had been destroyed by Montenegro interference. All part of the extensive records Thomas had kept, transformed now from trophies of conquest into monuments of remembrance. Raphael sat behind the same desk where he had first confronted her with the truth about her grandmother. But he too had been transformed. The bitter isolation that had defined him for 20 years had been replaced by something that could only be called purpose. His grey eyes, once clouded with guilt and self-loathing, now held a clarity that came from finally knowing who he was and what he needed to do. Mrs. Davidson confirmed the transfer. He said, hanging up the telephone and making a note in the ledger open before him. "The house in Edinburgh has been fully restored and returned to her family." She cried when she heard that her grandfather's pocket watch had been preserved all these years. Eloise smiled from where she sat in the window seat, sorting through another box of personal effects that Thomas had hoarded. Each item represented a life touched by Montenegro cruelty, and returning them to their rightful owners, or their descendants, had become a sacred mission for both of them. "That makes 47 families contacted," she said, holding up a child's silver christening cup that gleamed in the afternoon light. "This one has an inscription, 'To our beloved Mary,' on the occasion of her baptism, 1923. If she's still alive, she'd be in her 60s now." "We'll find her," Raphael said with quiet confidence. "We'll find them all." The work was painstaking, often heartbreaking, but it had also been healing in ways neither of them had expected. Each family they contacted, each story they helped complete, each wrong they managed to right. In some small way, it all contributed to the gradual transformation of the Montenegro legacy from something shameful into something meaningful. The investigations into Thomas's criminal enterprises had been thorough and devastating. The authorities had uncovered a network of illegal activities that spanned decades and reached into some of the highest levels of British society. The scandal had indeed dragged the Montenegro name through every newspaper in England, just as Mrs. Pemberton had predicted. But rather than destroying them, the public exposure had somehow liberated them. "I never thought I'd say this," Eloise mused, "but I'm grateful for the newspapers. Without them, some of these families never would have come forward. They never would have known what really happened to their loved ones." Raphael wheeled his chair over to where she sat, taking her hand in his and bringing it to his lips. The simple gesture still sent electricity through her, even after months of stolen moments and growing intimacy. "Speaking of newspapers," he said, "there's something I need to show you." He reached for a folded paper on his desk, not one of the sensational tabloids that had been following their story, but the Times, open to the society pages. There, in elegant script, was an announcement that made Eloise's heart skip. "Mr. Raphael Montenegro and Miss Eloise Clayton are pleased to announce their engagement. The couple plan to marry this autumn at Ravenshollow Manor, with proceeds from the celebration to benefit the Montenegro Family Restoration Fund." "You put it in the paper without asking me?" Eloise asked, but she was smiling as she said it. "I wanted the whole world to know," Raphael replied. "I wanted to make it official, irreversible. No more secrets, no more shame, no more hiding from who we are or what we mean to each other." She leaned down to kiss him, tasting the salt air that seemed to follow him everywhere and the promise of a future that was entirely their own creation. The kiss was interrupted by Mrs. Pemberton's arrival, carrying a tea service and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement that was entirely out of character for her usual stern demeanor. "There's been a development," she announced, setting down the tray with unusual haste. "Rather extraordinary development, actually." "What kind of development?" Raphael asked. Instead of answering directly, Mrs. Pemberton retrieved an envelope from her apron pocket, expensive stationery, formally addressed, with a return address that made both Raphael and Eloise straighten in their chairs. "It's from the Crown Estate Office," Mrs. Pemberton said. "It arrived this morning by special courier." Raphael opened the letter with hands that trembled slightly, reading the contents twice before looking up at them with an expression of complete bewilderment. "What does it say?" Eloise demanded. "It seems," Raphael said slowly, "that our work hasn't gone unnoticed. The Crown is establishing a new commission for historical justice, investigating cases of systemic abuse by powerful families and providing resources for victim compensation. And they're asking us to head it." The room fell silent except for the gentle ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of waves against the cliffs. Eloise felt her world shift once again, but this time toward possibilities she had never dared imagine. "They want us to do this officially?" she asked. "With government support. With government funding, legal authority, and access to resources we could never have assembled on our own," Raphael confirmed. "They're offering us the chance to help not just the families damaged by the Montenegros, but families harmed by other powerful interests throughout British history." Mrs. Pemberton was beaming now, her stern facade completely abandoned. "Margaret would be so proud," she said softly, "to know that her granddaughter is being asked to lead a commission for justice, to help families like ours find truth and healing." "It's perfect," Eloise breathed, then looked at Raphael with sudden concern. "Unless you don't want to take it? I know you value your privacy, and this would put us even more in the public eye." Raphael laughed, and the sound was pure joy, untainted by the bitterness that had colored his voice for so many years. "Privacy? Eloise, we're planning to get married in a house where a man was shot 6 months ago, after publicly exposing 3 generations of family crimes. I think our relationship with privacy is well beyond repair. Besides," Mrs. Pemberton added practically, "this house could use the income. The legal fees and compensation payments have rather depleted the Montenegro accounts." It was true. They had liquidated most of the family's remaining assets to fund their restoration efforts, keeping only the house itself and enough to live modestly. The proposed government salary would allow them to maintain Ravenshollow Manor while expanding their work to help even more families. "There's one condition," Raphael said, reading further into the letter. "They want us to begin with a comprehensive investigation into the Montenegro family history itself. Every crime, every victim, every instance of abuse going back to the founding of the family fortune. It would become a public record, available to historians and researchers. The definitive reckoning, Eloise said. No more secrets, no more buried truths. No more shame, Raphael agreed. Are you ready for that? To have our family history dissected and displayed for the world to see? Eloise thought about her grandmother, living her entire adult life in fear of shadows from the past. She thought about Isabel, driven to suicide by truths she couldn't bear. She thought about Thomas, twisted by resentment and secrets into something monstrous. And she thought about all the families still waiting for answers, still carrying grief that had never been properly acknowledged. I'm ready, she said. But more than that, I want to do it. I want to be the one who finally tells Margaret's story, and Isabel's story, and the stories of all the other women who were silenced. Raphael's smile was radiant. Then we accept. As if summoned by their decision, the telephone began ringing. Mrs. Pemberton answered with her usual efficiency, but her expression grew increasingly excited as the conversation progressed. Yes, I'll tell them, she said finally, hanging up with a satisfied expression. That was Detective Inspector Morrison. They've arrested the last of Thomas's associates, a man in Hamburg who was coordinating the European side of the trafficking operation. The network has been completely dismantled. Another ghost laid to rest, another wound cauterized. Eloise felt as if they were slowly emptying the house of its accumulated darkness, replacing shadow with light, one revelation at a time. The rest of the afternoon passed in a flurry of planning and preparation. There were letters to write, arrangements to make, decisions about how to structure their new official role. But as evening approached, Eloise found herself drawn once again to the third floor, to the room where Isabel had painted in her final days. She had been coming here regularly since that first terrible night, partly to maintain the space as a memorial, but partly because she found peace in the bright, airy room with its view of the sea. Raphael found her there as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that rivaled anything Isabel had captured on canvas. "Penny, for your thoughts," he said, maneuvering his chair to join her at the window. "I was thinking about Isabel," Eloise replied, "about how she wanted to expose the truth, but felt so alone in that desire. I wonder what might have happened if she had lived to see all this, the investigations, the justice, the recognition of what your father did." "She'd be proud of you," Raphael said. "Proud of us. But I think she'd also be amused to know that it took a woman from the very family our father tried to destroy to finally set things right." Poetic justice. Divine intervention. Perhaps. Raphael took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Eloise, I need to tell you something. About the accident, about how I ended up in this chair." She turned to look at him, seeing something in his expression that she hadn't seen before. Not shame or guilt, but a kind of hopeful vulnerability. "You don't have to. I want to. No more secrets, remember?" He smiled, but it was edged with something that might have been fear. "The doctors have always said that the damage to my spine wasn't as complete as it first appeared. That with the right treatment, the right therapy, I might regain some function in my legs." Eloise's heart stopped. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I never pursued it, because I didn't believe I deserved to get better. I thought the wheelchair was my punishment, my penance for all the evil I had allowed to flourish. But now I want to try. Not because I'm ashamed of who I am, not because I think you'd love me more if I could walk, but because I want to dance with you at our wedding. I want to be able to chase our children around this house someday. I want to live fully instead of just surviving." Tears were streaming down Eloise's face, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. She leaned forward and kissed him with all the love and hope and fierce determination that had brought them through so much darkness. "When?" she whispered against his lips. "The treatments would start after we finish with the Commission's initial investigation," Raphael said. "It could take months, maybe years, and there's no guarantee it will work." "It will work," Eloise said with absolute conviction, "because we've learned that Montenegro men are apparently too stubborn to stay defeated permanently." Their laughter filled the room, chasing away the last shadows of Isabel's grief and replacing them with the possibility of joy. 3 months later, on a crisp October morning, with Yorkshire's autumn colours painting the moors in brilliant gold and scarlet, Eloise Clayton became Mrs. Raphael Montenegro in a ceremony that defied every convention their respective families had ever held dear. The wedding took place not in a grand church or cathedral, but in the gardens of Ravenshollow Manor, with the wild North Sea providing a dramatic backdrop and the October wind carrying the scent of salt and dying leaves. The guest list included not only the few remaining members of polite society who still acknowledged the Montenegro name, but also dozens of the families they had helped reunite with their stolen heirlooms and lost histories. Mrs. Pemberton, resplendent in a new grey dress that perfectly matched her hair, served as both mother of the bride and official witness. Detective Inspector Morrison attended with his wife, having developed an unexpected friendship with the couple during the long investigation. And in the front row, clutching a lace handkerchief and weeping openly, sat an elderly woman named Mary Hartwell. The christening cup they had found months earlier had led them to her, and through her, to a dozen other relatives who had never known what happened to their family's missing patriarch in 1923. The ceremony itself was simple but profound. Raphael had insisted on writing their vows himself, and when he spoke them, his voice carried across the garden with the same authority that had once intimidated her, but now promised only love and partnership. "I promise you truth," he said, his grey eyes fixed on her face as if she were the only person in the world. "No more secrets between us, no more shame about where we came from or who we used to be. So I promise you justice, not just for our families but for everyone we can help along the way. I promise you adventure, because building something better from the ashes of the past is the greatest adventure I can imagine. And I promise you my love, freely given, completely honest, for as long as we both draw breath." Eloise's own vows were shorter but no less heartfelt. "I promise to stand with you against the darkness, to help you carry the light we've found together, and to never let the sins of the past define the possibilities of our future. I promise to love you not in spite of your scars, but because they're part of the story that brought us together. And I promise that when our children ask about their heritage, we'll tell them the whole truth, the darkness and the light, the shame and the redemption, the love that conquered it all." When they kissed as husband and wife, the assembled guests erupted in applause that seemed to echo off the cliffs themselves. But Eloise was barely aware of the celebration around them. She was focused entirely on Raphael, on the way he looked at her as if she were a miracle he still couldn't quite believe was real. The reception that followed was unlike anything Ravenshollow Manor had ever hosted. Instead of the formal dinners and stuffy society gatherings that had once filled these rooms, the house rang with genuine laughter and honest conversation. Children who had never seen such opulence ran through the corridors that had once been filled only with ghosts, and their parents shared stories of loss and recovery that would have been impossible before the Montenegro truth came to light. As evening approached and the last guests began to depart, Eloise found herself standing in the doorway of the main hall, watching Raphael navigate the crowd in his wheelchair, shaking hands and accepting congratulations with a grace that spoke of deep contentment rather than mere social obligation. "He looks happy," Mrs. Pemberton said, appearing at her elbow with 2 glasses of champagne. "We both are," Eloise replied, accepting the drink. "For the first time in our lives, I think we both are." "Margaret would have loved to see this day," the older woman said softly, "to know that her granddaughter found not just love but purpose, that the Montenegro name is finally being used for healing instead of harm." "She did see it," Eloise said with quiet conviction. "I felt her here today during the ceremony. And Isabel, too. They're both at peace now." Mrs. Pemberton nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "What will you do now? After the honeymoon, I mean. The commission work won't officially begin until the new year." Eloise smiled, thinking of the plans she and Raphael had been making in whispered conversations during the long summer evenings. "We're going to travel, to visit every family we've contacted, to meet them in person and hear their stories firsthand. We want to understand not just what was taken from them, but what they built in spite of that loss. A pilgrimage of sorts. A pilgrimage of healing," Eloise agreed. "And when we come back, we're going to transform this house completely. Turn it into a center for family restoration, a place where people can come to research their own histories and find resources for recovering what was lost. The Montenegro Foundation for Historical Justice," Mrs. Pemberton said, testing the words. "It has a nice ring to it," Raphael's idea. He says it's time the Montenegro name stood for something other than exploitation and cruelty. As if summoned by their conversation, Raphael appeared beside them, his face flushed with excitement and champagne. "Have you been planning our future without consulting me, Mrs. Montenegro?" The sound of her new name sent a thrill through Eloise that she suspected would never fade. Mrs. Montenegro. Mrs. Raphael Montenegro. A name that had once represented everything dark and twisted in her family's history, now transformed into something that belonged entirely to her. "Always," she replied, leaning down to kiss him. "Someone has to keep you organized." "Speaking of organization," Raphael said, "there's something I need to show you both. Something that arrived while we were dealing with the wedding preparations." He led them to the study, their study now transformed from a place of secrets into a center of transparency and hope. On the desk, surrounded by the usual papers and photographs of their restoration work, was a single envelope bearing an unfamiliar return address. "It's from a solicitor in Edinburgh," Raphael explained as he opened it. "Representing the estate of someone named Catherine Morrison." "Morrison?" Mrs. Pemberton frowned. "That's a common enough name, but—" "She was 93 when she died last month," Raphael continued, reading from the letter. "According to this, she had been following our story in the newspapers. She left something for us in her will, something she said belonged to the Montenegro family, but had never been properly returned." From the envelope, he withdrew a small key and another, smaller envelope sealed with old-fashioned wax. The seal bore the impression of a ship, the Montenegro family crest. "What do you think it is?" Eloise asked, studying the key. It was old, ornate, clearly designed for something important. "Only one way to find out," Raphael said, opening the second envelope. Inside was a brief note in an elderly woman's shaky handwriting, along with what appeared to be a map of London, drawn sometime in the early 20th century. "My dear Mr. and Mrs. Montenegro," Raphael read aloud, "I have followed your work with great interest and admiration. It gives me hope to see young people choosing to heal the wounds their ancestors inflicted rather than perpetuate them. I am writing to tell you about something I have kept secret for 70 years, waiting for someone worthy to entrust it to. When I was 23 years old, I worked as a maid for a family in Mayfair. During the London Blitz, many wealthy families moved their most precious possessions to secure locations outside the city. I was tasked with helping to pack and transport these items. Among them was a collection belonging to a Mr. Don Montenegro, documents, jewelry, and personal effects that he said contained the complete history of his family's achievements. He rented a safety deposit box at Harrods Bank, and I was given a key for safekeeping in case something happened to him. Mr. Montenegro died during an air raid in 1943, but I never returned the key. I couldn't bring myself to turn it over to his heirs, because I had heard stories about the family, stories about what they had done to people like my own sister. I kept it instead, thinking that someday the right person would come along, someone who would use whatever was in that box for justice instead of further cruelty. I believe that person is you. The box number is 4471. The bank still exists, though it has been sold several times since the war. I hope whatever you find helps in your work of healing. With greatest respect, Catherine Morrison." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Somewhere in London, in a safety deposit box that had been sealed for over 70 years, lay what might be the complete record of Montenegro family crimes, documented, preserved, waiting to be discovered. Don Montenegro's private papers, Mrs. Pemberton breathed. Everything he considered too sensitive even for his own house. The missing pieces, Eloise added, the evidence that Thomas could never find, that even his father kept separate from the main family records. Raphael was staring at the key as if it might transform into a serpent at any moment. "Are we ready for this? For whatever we might find in that box?" "Are we ever ready for the truth?" Eloise countered. "But that doesn't mean we can avoid it." "No," Raphael agreed, "and we shouldn't avoid it. Whatever's in there, whatever additional horrors we discover, we'll face them the same way we've faced everything else, together, honestly, with the determination to use the truth for healing instead of harm." He closed his hand around the key, and Eloise covered his hand with hers. Mrs. Pemberton placed her hand on top of theirs, completing the circle, To the truth, Mrs. Pemberton said solemnly. To justice, Raphael added. To love, Eloise finished. The love that makes all the rest possible. Outside, night was falling over the Yorkshire coast, but inside Ravenshollow Manor, the lights burned bright. The house that had hidden secrets for centuries was now dedicated to revealing them. The family that had built its fortune on exploitation and cruelty was now committed to healing and restoration. And the woman who had arrived 6 months earlier seeking revenge had instead found redemption, not just for herself, but for everyone touched by the Montenegro legacy. As they sat together planning their journey to London, to the safety deposit box that might hold the final pieces of their family's dark puzzle, Eloise reflected on how completely her life had changed. She had come to this house expecting to find a monster, and instead discovered a man wounded by the same forces that had shaped her own family's tragic history. She had come seeking to destroy and instead learned to heal. She had come alone and found not just love, but purpose that could sustain them both for the rest of their lives. The storm that had raged the night Thomas died seemed like a lifetime ago now. The darkness that had filled these rooms, the bitterness that had consumed Raphael, the fear that had defined her grandmother's entire adult life, all of it had been transformed into something life-giving, something that honored the past while refusing to be limited by it. What are you thinking about? Raphael asked, noting her contemplative silence. I'm thinking about cycles, Eloise replied. How the choices we make echo through generations, shaping the lives of people we'll never meet. How your father's cruelty created my grandmother's trauma, which shaped my mother's fearfulness, which influenced how I saw the world. But also how our choice to break that cycle, to choose healing over revenge, love over hatred, how that will echo forward too. To our children, Raphael said softly. To our children's children. To families we'll never know who will benefit from the work we're doing now. To a future where the Montenegro name is associated with justice instead of exploitation. Mrs. Pemberton smiled, her stern features transformed by genuine joy. Margaret's great-great-grandchildren will grow up in a world where truth is valued over secrecy, where love is stronger than shame. That's quite a legacy to leave. As the evening deepened and they continued their planning, the three of them united in purpose and bound by a shared commitment to healing, Eloise felt a profound sense of completion. Not the ending of their story, but the beginning of its most important chapter. Tomorrow they would begin the journey to London, to the safety deposit box that held the final secrets of the Montenegro family history. Next month, they would start their work with the Crown's new Commission for Historical Justice. Next year, they would welcome their first guests to the Montenegro Foundation for Historical Justice, housed in the completely transformed Ravenshollow Manor. And through it all, they would face each challenge together. Raphael with his quiet strength and growing hope for physical healing, Mrs. Pemberton with her protective love and encyclopedic knowledge of the family's hidden history, and Eloise with her determination to honor her grandmother's memory by creating the kind of love story Margaret had always deserved. The darkness that had defined the Montenegro legacy for generations was finally lifting, replaced by a light that grew stronger with each truth revealed, each family reunited, each act of justice performed in service of healing rather than revenge. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all, not the destruction of their enemies or the accumulation of wealth and power, but the simple revolutionary act of choosing love over fear, truth over secrecy, healing over harm. As Raphael had promised in his wedding vows, they had built something beautiful from the ashes of the past. And as Eloise had promised in return, they would carry that light forward into whatever challenges awaited them, secure in the knowledge that love, honest, freely given, courageously maintained, could indeed conquer all. The storm had passed. The morning had come. And Mrs. Raphael Montenegro, granddaughter of Margaret Hartwell, keeper of truth and guardian of justice, was finally, completely, home.